Going live.
I don't think we have Cindy.
We don't.
She was on another hangout.
How do I get the link for this thing? Oh, I know. Because I knew before. I apologize. We did plan this whole thing out. Um,
It happens with hangouts.
Ah.
so, here it is at the bottom. The link. Here's the YouTube page where this is. Here's the YouTube page. At the bottom. Here is the event page in Google+. Okay, let's get started. And so, welcome everybody. I'm Jai Ranganathan, and I am one of the people behind SciFund Challenge. And in this conversation, we are going to be talking about science crowdfunding and what does it take to succeed at science crowdfunding. And we have a great panel here today. We're pretty much the experts on the topic. So the general order of the discussion is going to be, we're going to be talking about people's individual experience with science crowdfunding, both on the natural science side as well as the social science side. And then we'll be talking about bigger issues in science crowdfunding. Okay, so let's get started. Maybe the first person we can start with is with David Schiffman, who is a graduate student at the University of Miami and is also kind of the king of social media when it comes to marine biology. You might ask him about Shark Week. He has a thing or two to say about that. So, but David, maybe you could talk a bit about your experience with science crowdfunding. What was your project? What worked? What didn't work for you?
Sure. So I am a PhD student at the University of Miami, and the project that I entered into the last SciFund challenge was one of my dissertation chapters, which is stable isotope analysis feeding ecology. It's Bayesian modeling based on biogeochemical interactions. It's very, very complicated stuff, and I was concerned that it might not be able to attract public interest. As a science communicator, we're always taught don't use jargon, and stable isotope analysis has just a huge amount of jargon in it. But I was able to fund almost 300% of what I asked for.
And what do you think led to that?
We had a big part of it was having a strong social media presence to begin with. I was able to reach a wide audience through my own social media network, through several of the people on here, and through some science journalist friends that I know. So that helped get the word out. But what was particularly helpful in my case, and this won't always be the case for every project, but having good rewards. There were a lot of my funding came from people who donated at a particular relatively high level, which resulted in them getting to spend a day on the shark research boat with us. And that was set by the university. I didn't get to pick that. That's something that we just offer to the general public usually. But the ability, a lot of people did that. A lot of people did that as gifts for each other, and so that we raised a lot of money through that, and then there were a ton of just $5 and $10 donations here or there. And for stable isotope analysis, any amount helps. It costs about $10 to process one sample, so a small amount of money means one sample gets processed. But having these larger donations because of the rewards was a big help.
Great. So Ethan I'd like to turn to Ethan Perlstein, Dr. Ethan Perlstein, who is a researcher at Perlstein Lab and is kind of a real success story in the world of science crowdfunding. He's raised $25,000, which is, in the world of science crowdfunding anyway, a big number. So maybe you can tell us a bit about your project and how you got to that big number.
Yeah, so the genesis of the project was that I was leaving, my postdoc was ending, but I wanted the project to continue. And the one mechanism I saw for it to survive was in a collaboration, and one way I thought we could start to fund it was through crowdfunding. So this is in collaboration with David Solzer's lab, Professor David Solzer's lab at Columbia University Medical Center, and the experiments are actually done by Danny Krasashevsky. He's the project experimentalist. So we arrived at the $25,000 figure because we knew that that was sort of the minimum amount that people considered in a grant form that would be sustainable for a one-time seed fund, and that's called the RO3. So the money was kind of brought out in a symbolic way, but also practically speaking, we thought we could do something. We could do a defined project for that money. The reality was, it's a little more messy actually working in the lab, and of course there were a lot of bad things happening last year in terms of sequester and the continuing crisis in science. So the killer project we wanted to do hasn't been done, but there have been other experiments that have been done toward addressing the question we were asking, which was where do drugs like amphetamines accumulate in cells, particularly in brain cells of the mouse. The work I had done at Princeton as a postdoc was in yeast cells, and that was just part of the collaboration, was to try to parlay that. So we thought that was also a cool hook in terms of what would make a crowdfunding campaign work. So that was the genesis of the project. I think what worked was pretty simple: hustle. That hustle takes lots of forms, starting with, we had a launch party the first night, and we had laptops there. We would collect donations, kind of modeled after political campaign launch parties. I and Danny went out to many events. I'm essentially the campaign manager. So just going out there and being on call all the time, in the flesh, but then also obviously online. You can't be everywhere all the time. So working on, I was pretty, I think, responsibly shameless on Facebook and getting my family and then friends from all periods of my life to donate. So that was actually really encouraging. That kind of built the foundation of the campaign, and then turned to Twitter and kind of activated the following I had gathered through just kind of being a proponent of open science and maybe some considered a radical of open science. So that's kind of how it shook out in terms of what worked. And what didn't work is pretty simple: inaction. If you just think your campaign's going to go viral somehow or go organic and people are just going to word of mouth talk to each other at dinner that night the moment they click the link, you're kidding yourself. So I think if you're willing to hustle, it can work.
Well, just to talk about that a second, Ethan, you mentioned the word hustle a couple of times, but I feel like a lot of people do the hustle, but you seem to have more hustle. Yeah. So what do you think accounts for that? Because usually the numbers most people get in science crowdfunding campaigns are an order of magnitude less.
Yes, you really have to bust your chops if you want to raise something like 25K. It becomes, that's why I say, I think the analogy is to a campaign manager, which is clearly not sustainable. And you don't want to ask, for example, PIs to go from writing grants all the time to managing crowdfunding campaigns all the time. That would be like NPR having a fund drive every other week. So I think there has to be some kind of balance there.
Well, that's great. So I'd like to switch over to talking about the social science perspective. So maybe we can switch to talking to Dr. Amelia Green, who is a professor at Drexel University, and she works on some really interesting stuff and the questions on violence and conflict and how to prevent conflict, violence affecting civilians. She's involved a lot with the UN, so coming from a very different perspective. You ran a successful social science crowdfunding campaign. What was your experience like, and how might that have different from the natural science perspective?
I actually think that in terms of getting successfully funded, my experience wasn't that different. Just to give a little bit of background about what the project was, I was asking for money to fund a research assistant because my sort of current big project is a gigantic global data set on armed group institutions. So essentially reading a lot of books and calling up a lot of experts to figure out whether armed organizations, that's rebels, that's pro-government militias, that's government armed forces, etc. What sorts of things do they do within their armed group to kind of keep control over combatant behavior? Which really interesting question that nobody, or at least I think it's a really interesting question that nobody has talked about much in the political science literature, and that draws on a lot of interdisciplinary stuff from behavioral economics, from psychology. And I think I was sort of, I had an advantage to begin with, just due to the fact that my topic is kind of, for lack of a less horrible term, sexy. It's everybody is fascinated when we talk about sort of what goes on in war. People know that violence is bad. I had this tagline, "War is bad for your brain," which turns out to be true, and which is sort of an assumption underlying the kind of institutional research that I do. In any case, I asked for money to fund my summer research assistant, Arhama, who's fabulous. I work at an all undergraduate institution, or at least my department is all undergraduate, so this is an undergrad research assistant full-time for 6 months. And yeah, I found, yes, hustle, absolutely. And I think, my rewards turned out not to matter that much. I didn't have that great of stuff to offer. Have a tote bag that says Armed Group Institutions Database. Maybe not so much. And there's not a lot of nobody can come on my shark boat. My shark boat is like a really tiny room with cinder block walls and a laptop that we borrow from somebody else. So that part, the rewards don't work for me that much. A thing that I actually wanted to talk about today in particular is this question of kind of networks. A thing that I worry about a lot in academia in general and with my work in particular is sort of how much I'm relying on my personal networks, on my friends, on my family, etc. And I wonder about academics, students, other people who don't have access to relatively rich networks, whether they would have the same level of success that I do. I know that the majority of my funding came from people I knew personally, in particular from relatively wealthy older relatives. And it's possible that if I had hustled more, that would be different. As it was a thing that I really worried about just in terms of sort of equal access issues. But in general, I don't think my lessons are that different from those that other people have brought up.
So I'd like to introduce Dr. Barbara Walker, who is a researcher at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and another social science researcher, and who's also run a science crowdfunding campaign. So is your experience similar to Amelia's, different? What do you think?
My experience in terms of lessons learned is very similar, but I have a lot to offer based on failure as opposed to based on success. So, and I always like to blame my age for this. I am sort of a pre-Twitter, Facebook age, and so I had no social networks whatsoever when I started the SciFund challenge, and I was in that first round with several collaborators who are also all over 40. And we really assumed that it was going to be the build it and they will come model of crowdfunding. But through the training that you guys put us through in that first round, I can't say this for my collaborators, but I at least tried to sort of get up and running and make more contacts with the types of people who are doing blogging and other types of social media around my research area as the crowdfunding campaign was ongoing. And at that point it was just too late. So my research briefly is about understanding the culture of climate change in French Polynesia and seeing how climate change makes sense for people who are sort of living through it and responding to it on the fly. So it's potentially a project that would sort of pull at the heartstrings of a lot of people. But we just were not prepared and didn't have sort of the bandwidth going into the SciFund challenge to make all of those connections in time for the campaign to be a success. And I think we ended up with about $250 in donations from friends and family.
All right. So maybe it's a good time to sort of think about a step beyond that, because a lot of people have been looking at the research beyond just individual projects and looking at the broader picture here. And one key person behind that, or two key people behind that, would be Dr. Jared Burns and Dr. Zen Fox, who had a paper that just came out. I'm on that paper too. Barbara Walker as well. All four of us are on this call. Looking at a certain experiment for a science crowdfunding challenge, what worked, what didn't work. So Zen and Jarrett, what did you find in this paper?
Sure, I'll start. Yeah, so first off, thanks for having this chat, Jai. The paper was really interesting. So as we started the SciFund Challenge, one of our big questions was, what is it that actually makes crowdfunding for science work? Obviously, we've all sort of watched a variety of people go through crowdfunding in the arts, business, technology, and seen stories ranging from very popular products and very popular artists having tremendous success with crowdfunding, which was sort of in some ways would seem like no surprise there. These are people who've created huge audiences for their work. We've also seen a variety of people who've gone through and had sort of almost seemingly random projects, almost as if they were putting them up for crowdfunding, as if to mock the process of crowdfunding itself, and who also strangely have become very successful. So we really were wondering, how does crowdfunding work for science? And so we went through all of you who have been participants in the SciFund Challenge, our data points, and we thank you for that. And we queried all of the participants in the 3 rounds of SciFund, or actually we've queried participants in round 4 as well, about different strategies and techniques they used, and then tried to correlate that with some measure of success, so basically dollars raised in the end. And Zen was fantastic and went through and collected a variety of online statistics and that we were able to pull in as well. And the sort of central message, I think, behind what we found so far is, first off, as Barbara said, if you build it, they won't come. As Ethan said, it requires hustle. It requires you to actually be able to go out. But it really depends on, I think in the end, what's been interesting to me is it's come down to 3 forms of networks. There's definitely a very strong social and personal network component, and I think that's something that we can talk about a good bit more. I think Amelia raises some very interesting points. There's also 2 other components. One is the networks that one has built through outreach types of activities. So we quantify this by looking at Twitter presence, assuming that Twitter is a more professional space than Facebook, so that you're going to not only have, sure, there will be some social network numbers there, but you will also have a lot of people that follow you who are part of your professional community and follow your work because they're interested in it. And last, and that also, that definitely played a role. And last, we looked at just direct emailing and emailing contacts, which does combine some degree of or sorry, not email, that feeds into personal, but we looked at press contact. So if you manage to contact somebody in the press who is able to disseminate information about your project to a wider audience, knowing that, of course, that sort of dissemination, it's not going to happen with every single contact you make, but if you put the effort in, you can eventually get that word out to a much larger network about what you're doing. Will that lead to success? And that indeed also turned out to be a very important pathway. So we sort of found 3 pathways: the personal, the professional, and sort of a press or sort of megaphone pathway, if you will. And to me, the interesting thing about this is that your personal social network can only grow so much. I mean, sure, as we can increase that through time, we meet more people, we have more contacts, but things like your professional networks, your outreach-generated networks, the contacts that you make with people in science communication fields that can also get the word out, those are all things that through active outreach and active good communication by you as a scientist, those are all areas that you can grow. So that's sort of my take home. I think there's a wide variety of other avenues that we're just starting to see that can lead to good funding for science crowdfunding, or for good science crowdfunding. I think David's definitely starting to hit on some of that with a sort of citizen science angle, or real involvement of people in the process of science itself. But I think that's something we can talk more about at the discussion. That's kind of one of the next things I'm very curious about.
Zen, what do you think? You are muted, by the way, Zen.
Unmuted. There we go. And yeah, I think there's still plenty in terms of what makes for successful crowdfunding. One of the problems I think, is that the landscape has already changed. That this is that things in terms of science crowdfunding is evolving like fairly quickly. So I think that some of the things that we have already learned, may I think are still valid. But I mean, there's clearly a lot more for us to learn in terms of as new tools become available, tools are going to change. The ways that people are going to be able to reach with other people are going to be affected as well. So this is very much early days, I think, in the crowdfunding process. I mean, certainly when we did the very first round of SciFund, we had no idea what to expect, none. And now I think that we have a much more realistic and refined expectation. If you're going to do a crowdfunding campaign, what are the kinds of things that you need to expect and the kinds of things that you need to do. So I think I don't think that we should take this, the paper that we just released last week as anything like the definitive word. I think it should be viewed as the first word instead.
And speaking of other words, I'd like to bring Cindy Wu into the discussion now. And Cindy is the co-founder of one of the maybe the leading science crowdfunding site out there, experiment.com. And you've run tons of projects through your site. What do you see?
Yeah, so we've run over 600 projects, I think, through the platform. And I think a lot of people define a successful project as a project that raises their funding goal. But we find that maybe we should define a successful project in a different way, and that would be building an audience online of people that are interested in your work. And so one of our most popular features on the platform is the Lab Notes feature. So on Experiment, none of the researchers provide any sort of tangible rewards, but what they offer is they offer an like insiders look into what they're doing in the lab or doing in the field. And what we find is that a lot of the backers, what they're interested in is seeing that the research is progressing. And so what we find is that a lot of the donors are really engaged in the content that the scientists are providing.
So when you talk about your lab notes, is that basically like a blog for the researcher? Was that essentially what it is?
Similar to a blog, a lot of the scientists are also posting data, so preliminary data of what they're finding with their research. But it can also be used as a blog. I know that a lot of the scientists also have an external blog where they talk about things that are maybe not related to that specific project.
Cindy, you mentioned there seemed to be some connection between, donors seem to really appreciate using this this lab notebook space. Do you notice any connection between the frequency that scientists are using this lab notebook and, I don't know how you'd measure this, but attention of donors, how much they're giving, anything like that, even in a qualitative way?
So we've noticed that the researchers that post more lab notes, especially lab notes that have new content, get more donors that are not within their initial network. So those are the lab notes that really go viral on Reddit because it's more about the content and the information that the researchers are providing and less about the researcher just directly asking for funding.
Great, and so I'd like to bring Ethan back into the conversation because you've done a ton of your own research about looking at the big picture for science crowdfunding. And how are your conclusions different, or are they the same of the other people talking here?
I mean, I think it's generally the same. I actually am most encouraged by how science crowdfunding is more recently evolving, even in the last few months. I think going back to the summer, everyone remembers the Ice Bucket Challenge. I think that was an amazing example of virality, but sort of well-deserved virality. But again, there are thousands of other rare diseases like ALS, and you can't expect all of them to get an Ice Bucket Challenge. But then I think and that was, I should remind people, that was $112 million over the course of 5 or 6 weeks, which was amazing. I mean, there was a week there after, I think after Bill Gates tweeted about and showed himself getting dumped, that it really kind of took off in the middle of August. So I think that's just a really amazing example of you can activate a community of people who have no personal relationship to ALS because it's so rare, and you can see this amazing outpouring. I think the other example that I'm really heartened by is actually sort of more hard direct science. And it shows another example of, I think, how crowdfunding is evolving. There was this Ebola crowdfunding campaign on Cure CrowdRise, and it was a researcher from Scripps, and she was trying to ask for 100K to scale up ZMapp productions. This relates to the Ebola outbreak, which obviously was on everybody's minds the last few months. And what was interesting there was it was 100K, and yet a big chunk of that came from a matching donor who said, I'm going to come in and match, it wasn't it was dollar for dollar for a certain amount. And so, $25,000, was essentially comes in a match like this. I think that's a really interesting example of how, crowdfunding can maybe really grow the goals higher if you combine the social network part of it with institutional or angel or patron type donors who can come in and match dollar for dollar. And I think NPR does this very successfully. Other nonprofits do this very successfully too. So I think that's an example of where I think crowdfunding is starting to evolve in really interesting ways, and hopefully inspires scientists who want to make their science available through crowdfunding too.
So I think we can look at, Ethan, you and I have had a bit of a discussion on Twitter for recently, and on the question of how important is it, and this may be a question for everyone, how important is it to build your own personal audience versus tapping into existing audiences? And Ethan, maybe we can start with you. So what do you think about how do you put those two things together?
I mean, I think they can both work. When I was with experiment.com, we saw an example of a professor named Dan Jaffe, and I don't believe he, was very active on Facebook or Twitter at all. And he didn't necessarily, I don't think, solicit press, but he was covered in the local newspaper, the Seattle Times. He's based in the University of Washington, and his project took off, and it raised 14K in as many hours. And he was addressing a question that the community of Seattle wanted to know an answer to, and they were basically waiting for a scientist who could competently do that experiment. Dan Jaffe was the person to do that, and this is an example I call locally sourced science. That model works. He didn't have any personal following, and I don't think he has any interest in generating a following going forward. The people who donated might be return donors because they're interested in this kind of, probably it's going to become more of a citizen science project, hopefully, as well. So I think that's a really interesting example of someone who had no personal following, and look what they've created a kind of a way of doing science crowdfunding that I think is very interesting. On the other hand, you can do it if you have a personal following. And of course, I think your ability to raise money scales with sort of the wealth of your social network. I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward, but I think that can only take you so far. And again, I think the real potential for crowdfunding to scale is when you get individual donors and institutional donors, who are going to match dollar for dollar, or at some ratio, and get more stake from people who have bigger pools of money available.
So Jared, Zen, and Barbara, what do you think about that? Does that seem to fit with the paper that just came out, or is it kind of different?
I think that what Ethan is talking about is something that we haven't, in SciFund, we really couldn't really address in the paper that we just wrote. So especially in because some of those stories are just that, they're stories, they're one-offs. And we saw some of the cases like that in SciFund. I think a really good example, we had a couple of cases where in round one, we had Christina Kilgrove, who had a story that got picked up on the CNN website by Ed Yong, and she had great success with that. But that kind of single story is very difficult to capture in the kind of analysis that Jarrett did. And so when you have these kinds of emerging trends and you have these sort of single cases, not everybody, as Ethan said, can do the ice buckets challenge. Not every project is going to go mysteriously viral like potato salad guy or what have you. So those kinds of things, I think, are tricky for us to really get a handle on what consistently makes for successful projects in the way that we were just talking about in our paper.
I also think it's interesting in the example that Ethan gave that it was a local scientist doing a local project, and he got press in his local area. So perhaps if I had been studying, human reactions to climate change in Santa Barbara, coming from UC Santa Barbara, getting this in the Santa Barbara News Press, I can see how that would have taken off a lot more than, you know, a Latina from California doing a research project on French Polynesia and me expecting to get a lot of support from the French Polynesians who, you know, I'm in the field there not as often as I am here in Santa Barbara. So that, to me, makes a real difference for that special case in Washington, which is really interesting.
Well, this gets to a question which I think Amelia raised before, but it's being brought up on Twitter now, which is this just sort of the question of is this just a way for the rich to get richer, in the sense that Amelia's question and Karen James is asking this as well, in the sense that does this just mean that those who have the wealthier networks who are already well off, does this just means more money for them, and is this just another case of the rich getting richer with this? What do you think?
Effect.
So, well, I think I don't know. You're not asking me to answer, but can I answer for a second?
Go ahead.
I think that Ethan's point is really interesting about the sort of difference between how far one's personal network can go and how far we need to go to get really big money in terms of crowdfunding, or at least really big money, which is a whole other question. But I think, leaving aside for a second people who get picked up and somehow go viral well beyond their personal social networks, I really, I've seen this happen not just with SciFund, but with a couple of other sort of similar social media type projects. And I really think that if we look at only the population of projects, which I suspect is something like the majority of projects, question mark, that's for the authors of the study, right? But if we look at the population of projects that is relying primarily on social networks, professional networks, people they know more or less personally, then I would, my hypothesis would be that, yeah, that has a lot to do with whether, your mom and dad and aunts and uncles and family friends and so on are sort of upper middle class people or not. So that's a real, and that is a real worry for me, just as somebody who thinks about access a lot.
What do the rest of you think on the panel?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very valid point, and it's something that I've been sort of struggling with as I went through the analysis. And it's a question that I get a lot when I talk to people about our findings. Everyone sort of says, well, isn't it it's just about your parents, or it's just about your friends? And again, if you have access to a wealthy circle there, then sure, that will make a difference. But I wonder to what extent that scales, and that's the issue that I always come back to, is scaling. That may be able to scale that to a certain threshold. But beyond that, I actually don't. I think that's when putting the work in to be able to get the word out through different channels, through building an audience, through, I think, Ethan's point on starting to think about matching donors, or actually somehow tapping different pools that will match donations because they're actually interested in your topic. That's where things get more interesting, and we have the potential to reach different levels of funding. I'll give you an example. I'm forgetting the project, of course. We have had a few projects that have ended up collaborating with nonprofits directly. And so they went to those nonprofits and started working with them because their research was within the area of that nonprofit. So they were working on problems that were directly relevant to the non-governmental organizations with which they were sort of approaching. And they actually approached also just as peer research collaboration. Mm-hmm. By getting in touch with those relevant NGOs, they were able to, again, amplify their message, have it reach out to a much larger net of people than they would have otherwise. And that led to some really nice successes. So there's sort of that. And again, I don't think we have quite actually enough examples of that to be able to really quantify it. But that was another pathway we saw as a way of scaling out in a really interesting and very different way. So you have, I guess to sort of sum all of this up, so you have the fact that personal networks definitely there is definitely a personal network wealth effect, but I don't know to what extent it stops, but it stops somewhere. Beyond that, it requires building a good outreach network, having contacts with organizations that have a much larger social network than you would ever have access to that are relevant to your work, and maybe that's a city or maybe that's an NGO, depending. I think the city example is a great one. And last, I keep coming back to that press contacts pathway. In some ways, that one surprised me the most from the analysis. I knew that a lot of people tried to make contact with people in either online or print press, or tried to make contact with people that had an audience for science communication. And I thought we were just going to have so much variation that there would be no signal that came through that. And yet it was a fairly decent pathway. So I think that speaks to, again, trying to leverage different people or organizations that will broaden the size of the network that you can get the word out to, much broader than you ever could through your social network, and potentially broader than you could through your immediate professional or outreach network. So that's where you start to get the sort of force multiplier, if you will.
So I'd like to
levels.
So sorry to interrupt, Cindy. I'd like to bring you in. What is the limit for friends and family? If you've got the 600 projects or so, people who don't have much of a social network, is there some sort of natural threshold where they tend to stop?
So most projects have around like 80% of their donations come from their immediate network. Those are usually projects that are like $5,000 in size. But I actually don't think that crowdfunding is making the rich richer. I actually think what crowdfunding is doing is it's allowing a more level playing field for researchers to build an audience of people that are interested in their work. So one example is we had a graduate student that put up a project on, she studies spiders, and she didn't actually get many of her donations from her immediate network at all. It was all from her followers on Tumblr. So she had put up a Tumblr blog maybe 2 or 3 years ago and had gotten thousands of followers on that blog. And she puts up content that's like interesting things about spiders or other insects. And so I think that's the one really powerful thing about the internet, is if anyone on the internet wants to put up great, interesting, and science content, then they can build that audience, and from that audience be able to fund their research.
And could I also add in, Jai, one thing that sort of speaks against the criticism or the worry that it's just your parents is a lot of the data that we have in the new paper shows that it's the thing that is the tightest correlation to the amount that you raise is the number of donors, right? So the data does not support the idea that, oh, if you have rich parents, you're going to meet your crowdfunding campaign because your parents are going to dump a lot of money. No, they might. It might be nice if they do, but one of the things that surprised me was how consistent the donation amounts were. Like, you didn't get like a lot of cases of people donating $1 or $2 or $5. If they were going to donate, they seemed to donate $20 or $50. But and there were not that many cases where people would donate hundreds of dollars or anything like that. So all of that sort of speaks to the fact that it's, and in terms of like the idea that, oh, well, it's just your parents. That's not what the data show.
That's actually a good point. Just to throw this out there, figure 2 of the paper, which shows total number of contributors versus total amounts raised. And visually you can even see, just in terms of number of contributors, it was a remarkably tight correlation. We actually did do some analyses very early on looking at inequality in donation amount, and found that that wasn't a terribly good predictor. That was just sort of futzing around with round 1 data, and I think we were all surprised, as that was one of our initial questions was, oh, do you have, is this really just a couple of large donors that are really fueling each project, or projects that achieve particularly high values? Is that going to be due to just a small handful of large donors? But in the end, it was about numbers of donations. And again, that scrolling in forward into it, it then comes down to, all right, where are those numbers coming from? And they do come from a number of different sources. But at the end of the day, it's about number of people clicking with their average donation amount of around, what is it? I'm trying to look at the figure. Yeah, roughly $50 per donation, and that was remarkably consistent across all rounds.
Okay, I'd like to shift gears a bit. Question from Twitter from Rachel Zamzow. A big barrier for her has been in creating what she considers to be a high-quality video for her crowdfunding campaign. How important is that? How important is it to have a high-quality video for your campaign?
Well, we saw one of our SciFund videos in the early round have tremendous number of YouTube views. This was Diane Kelly's Duck Force video, and if you have never seen the explosive eversion of a duck penis, it is something to see. So the fact that you have, phenomenal animal genitalia, people will go and watch that. But that, in and of itself, the fact that she got a tremendous number of YouTube views did not lead to, she had this outlier when we plotted all the YouTube views as one of the factors that we were looking at. But that, oddly enough, did not, in and of itself, translate into donations. So I think that it is important to have a good video, but we've seen that a popular video does not a project make.
Other thoughts? What do people think? David, sounds like you have something to say.
Yeah, I thought in the last round that I participated in, by far the most slickly produced video and the most unique images were from Craig McLean's. And he was able to meet his funding goal, but it was like hectic until the last minute whether or not he was going to. So it wasn't just the amazing high quality video that he had that was responsible for whether or not he succeeded or failed. And I just had a video of me sitting at my desk explaining it that someone filmed and edited for me, and that worked fine. So I think it's necessary but not sufficient to have a video. Maybe I don't know what the data shows of the others, but in my own experience with my project, my video I think was fine, but certainly was not anything exciting.
And I think that for SciFund, almost everybody had videos, so it was really, we couldn't really tease out the effect of having a video or not on donations.
Okay, just to back up a bit, Amelia, it sounded like you had something more to say about the question of inequality in crowdfunding. And you are muted, by the way.
I'm just realizing that. Okay, yes. Here I am. I don't think I have that much more to say. This is sort of a sticking point for me, and I'm not. I think the kind of research design we're working with doesn't quite get us the sort of dispositive answers we'd like about whether your social networks, whether the wealth of your social networks, et cetera, is this a playing field leveler? Is this a wealth magnifier? What does it do, sort of socially speaking? One of the things that I think about is not, when we're interested in whether and to what extent your sort of personal and professional networks versus sort of larger public networks going viral, whatever. When we're interested in the extent to which these things make a difference, one of the big questions that I have is not exactly, is it, do your rich parents give you more money than other people, but rather, does your rich network just give you more contacts that are going to then, give money? Or does having a good cultural fit between the work that you do or your sort of belief that academia is interesting and important, having a good fit between those things and your networks, or even having a good fit between, being a cute, smiley blonde lady, and what likes to show up on media, right? Any of this stuff, is that affecting people's access to crowdfunding networks? And I know that there's been some chatter on Twitter in the last couple of minutes around the fact that, well, actually, maybe federal agencies and other funding sources are not that much better than crowdfunding. But I certainly think that because of the element of sort of, making a video in which you, with your face and your resources and your position, are asking people to give to you and your project, I continue to worry. And it doesn't mean that I'm not going to crowdfund again, because it was obviously very successful to me. But I am really looking forward to having sort of data that can really tease out the effects of kind of access to networks, not just size of networks, and sort of not just size of donations. So yeah, that's my kind of ongoing hobgoblin with these questions. Jarrett is asking in chat, how do we design this study? I taught methods this quarter, but I'm sorry, I don't have an answer yet.
Sorry, I'm just an ecologist who's trying social science for the first time.
It's cute. It's so cute. But I'm a social scientist, and I can't really think of it right now either. So.
So I'd like to transition another question from Twitter from John Hagerty, and this I think is maybe first going to push to Ethan. How do you approach press? We've talked a lot about the importance of getting press attention, but how do you actually do that? He asked, how do you approach these press pathways and actually get a response? I've sent out quite a lot of emails, but no response.
Yeah, you have to anticipate that it's not going to be something that it's 100% efficiency. You expect that maybe 10% of the press contacts you write are going to respond even, let alone write a story. So I think the way to do it is to just try to level up as you get coverage. So maybe start with a blog or a local news outlet or something where there's probably a much likely better fit, and that there's not as many things coming across the transom at that level. And then if you get that kind of a story, then that becomes a link you can put in an email that you send to someone at a bigger outlet, maybe a regional press outlet, or maybe a larger a specialty magazine or site. So I think that's to me is the general principle would be, expect that most of these cold calls aren't going to go anywhere, and then try to be strategic in getting progressively wider and deeper audience.
Other thoughts on that question of how you get press attention? Okay.
I was going to throw in. I think there are two ways, and this is totally anecdata, and so I'll preface it with that. There are two ways that I feel like I've seen press attention happen, and one is making sure that that press outlet is aligned with the interests of your project. So this is one reason that locally targeted projects can do so well. We had a graduate student here at UMass Boston who got press coverage for her project, and it was precisely because it was targeted at environmental remediation here in the Massachusetts area. It was out in Cape Cod, actually. So that, for me, was one pathway. If you really target well in terms of interest, and it is a really solid fit, and you can paint a compelling story that a journalist would want to pick up about your research, then yeah, that's definitely going to be a pathway forward. And sort of assisting with that is working with your university press office, which is something that not everybody's familiar with, and not everybody. I've had, like, complete aside, fantastic experience with the UMB press office. Not only about this, but actually talking about producing videos about things, or getting access to their resources to do more outreach kinds of work that I'd like to do to amplify my science. And they've been amazing with that. And that's not something that is sort of a very common thing, or it's not something that's necessarily always talked about or discussed as we're trained as scientists. So that sort of facilitates finding those outlets, because they will know those outlets who have those connections or that interest in your work. And the other, honestly, is just having a really solid presence that people are interested in beforehand. So that outreach presence, again, comes out. I think going back to the Christina Kilgrove example, one reason I think she had good success is she has a wildly popular blog where she is really good at connecting the science she does to the public. It has a great following, and part of that following is, there was at least one member of that following who was able to get that work up the food chain, as it were. So again, creating that outreach presence. David, I'd be curious to kind of hear from you if you feel like this works for you as well. Having that outreach presence that really establishes your that people are interested in your work may facilitate later press work. But as I said, that's anecdata, and I'm kind of curious, particularly what David has to say about this.
I had a good amount of press coverage for my SciFund project. Approximately zero of it even mentioned what my project was. Most of it was focusing on, if you donate to help this shark research, you can go do a day of shark research or things like that. And part of that is that just a function of my project being particularly complicated to explain, but also that the reward was exciting. But every reporter who wrote about it was someone that I previously had a relationship with.
Well, there you go.
One really important thing about press is after you reach out the first time, it's important to follow up with that journalist, maybe 2 or 3 days after, and just ask them to make sure that they got your note. One thing that works really well is also if you get the journalist to say no. So try to get them to say yes or no. If they say no, it's fine. You can move on to the next journalist. But having no answer doesn't really help you at all.
So a question coming, this is a great question from Stephen Hamblin. How much does subject matter make a difference? I mean, is science crowdfunding only for panda bears or for stuff that's seemingly easily accessible? He says that he sees way more animal projects than math projects. But you can pick your other topic, maybe theoretical physics, or pick your topic.
I can answer this because I feel like this is actually one of the places, I feel confident in answering this, because I feel like this is one of the places that we started with SciFund, is we were really worried that it was going to be the fuzzy animal projects. First off, in terms of the bias in subject matter, I will step right out there and say SciFund in particular has a bias in project because Jai and I started it, and Jai and I are ecologists, and our social networks are ecologists. We advertised on ecology places because that's what we know, and so that's who we got. And it's been spreading out beyond that, and I've been really happy about that as we've gotten scientists from other disciplines to spread the word. But there was definitely what we would call in the biz a priority effect. So there's that. We really worried that in the beginning it would be like, the fuzzy animal, the charismatic megafauna projects that would dominate. And kind of to test that, I can give you my own personal story. I ran a project that was about quantifying measurement error in a long-term data set. And I did that because it was about the most boring possible project I could think of that I did. And I did okay. Not as well as I would have liked, but enough to fund a full set of research cruises for the project. And to me, the message hasn't been are only interesting topics going to get funded. Rather, it's how interested are you as a scientist in your topic, and how much can you convey that passion and that interest. So if there's any sort of topic matter sort of thing there, it's really not about is your topic interesting, it's about are you interested in your topic, and are you willing to let that passion flow and let that out, and really get that out to the community around you. So it's, for me, a lot of it is about that passion.
What do you think, Cindy? I mean, you've seen, sorry, Zen, I cut you off. I'll get back to you in a second.
I was just going to say, in terms of, because we've talked about this a little bit in terms of, and I've said, for me, like, we sort of have anecdotes and stories at this point, but this is another thing that in terms of analysis, we don't have a panda bear index, right? So in terms of how do you measure which is a quote unquote sexy or publicly appealing project, it's sort of like, okay, well then you should put dinosaurs and space up at the top, statistics at the bottom, and where everything else sorts out in between, I don't know. But again, that's the kind of thing, it's like, well, can it work for something that is, how those things are going to be related is not clear to me. We didn't measure that in our paper. I would like to figure out how to measure that. But and at this point, we're just sort of basing it on the things that we've seen, and we don't actually have, I don't think, good evidence about that one way or another.
Cindy, what do you think? I mean, you have this huge database of projects that you've worked on.
Yeah.
Is there a connection between the sexiness of the science and the interest in the project?
So I agree with Jared. I think that the scientists that let their passion shine through definitely do better. We had a project that was on pandas and it didn't get funded, mainly because the researcher didn't do any outreach. And a lot of people saw the video. She got quite a few donations from people that she didn't know, but ultimately it wasn't a success story. And I think we ask a lot of the donors why they fund projects, and it's not necessarily always about the research. A lot of times it's because they identify with that researcher because it reminds them of them when they were younger, maybe in their graduate studies, or maybe they went to the same university, or maybe they're from the same state. And so I don't think that people are only funding projects because of the research project, but there are a lot of other factors that come into play.
Well, I think that this might be a good time to close the discussion. I know some of our panelists have to leave in a moment, so before we wrap up, I'd like to say thank you to the whole panel. If you'd like to, for the paper we mentioned with Jarrett and Zen and Barbara and myself that were on, you can find it. Just Google crowdfunding and PLOS One. That's PLOS space ONE, and you'll find the paper right away. We're going to be doing more of these sorts of public online discussions. If you'd like to hear them, sign up for our mailing list, which is at SciFund. If you go to SciFundChallenge.org, SCIFUND challenge.org, you can sign up for our mailing list to find out more about more of these discussions we'll be having. Any final comments from the panel?
If anyone's thinking about putting up a project and you want to talk about it before you decide to do it, you can email me. My email is cindy@experiment.com. You can set up a call.
Okay. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for bearing with the technical challenge at the beginning of the call, and thanks for coming. And thanks to the viewers for watching and all the great questions on Twitter. And let's keep the conversation going. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Jai.
Bye-bye.